processes along instead of having to really start from ground one. So then we kind of took this idea of collaborative studies and combining data and kind of put our money where our mouth is, and did some work with Salford University and Dr. Rich Jones. And this study was really built on several conversations over a number of years, where we started realizing that we had similarities between the eligibility of the participants in our labs, how we were collecting our gait data, how we were analyzing our gait data and modeling it, and then generally the kind of the philosophy and the direction that our labs are going. And this started making us think, well, maybe we can combat this small sample size issue that we often have in biomechanics and collaborate and combine our data. So, building off of that past study, we said, okay, we really need to develop a central analysis and processing procedure. So we did that. We had all the data combined and processed under the same model. So it was identical across labs. We had all the same outcome extraction procedure. So, if you care about some of the data, you can see some of these correlations between the knee adduction moment and the peak version. Yeah, right there. The big take homes here, though, for these collaborative studies, even when it's just combining data and not necessarily running a clinical trial at multiple sites, is data access is really important, especially when COVID hits and all of a sudden you don't have physical access to buildings. You need to have electronic access to networks, and that's not always as easy as you think. Another thing that we noticed is really important is cleaning the data. And I don't mean that in the typical biomechanical sense where you're smoothing and filling gaps for marker waveforms or what have you. But I mean, looking at the discrete outcomes and actually trying to ensure that your sign conventions are the same. You have sorted out all the rounding errors, your naming conventions, everything like that has been cleaned, because it's very easy to start missing things if you're not looking at your data really carefully. Of course, as I mentioned in the past reliability study, you need to determine whether there are differences or reliability issues in the data, and to what extent you have those, and then whether they're important or not. There are ways that you can try and address this, and one of those is through adjusting statistically, but you definitely don't want to rely on that as your sole means of accounting for the fact that there might be differences between lab data sets. So moving on from kind of just broad collaborative studies, now thinking about the traditional biomechanics studies are in-lab collections where we have motion capture and force plates involved. And again, these are certainly quick. You have all of the equipment you need in one place. You bring somebody in, you can run your collection and then send them home. So that's really helpful. You also are able to highly control the environment. By controlling the environment, you can make small experimental manipulations, and this might be useful for a given research question. Of course, in-lab collections have accessibility issues. You have the one lab, the one or two sets of graduate students who can run it certain times in the day, etc. There's obviously cost involvements. These labs aren't available at clinics. And then another question that I'm becoming more interested in is the external validity of the data that we actually collect in these gait labs. Generally, people are walking across a hard floor, it's been instrumented, or maybe it's a treadmill. Oftentimes we have their shorts hiked up to their nether regions so we can put markers on their legs appropriately. I don't know how conducive this walking is relative to people's natural walking. And this is where moving our biomechanics out of the lab into the real world can really become kind of the new avenue to collect data. Of course, with real world data and leveraging wearable sensors, we can start collecting very large within subject data over multiple days. Carrie mentioned a little bit about this, collecting 7 days of data, which is really, really powerful. The other piece is that the data we're collecting is actually representative of the movement they do in the day-to-day basis. And I think that's really important in getting improving our external validity of the measurements we're taking. Now, of course, with real world data, there's lots of variabilities and unknowns that come with it, and that can be difficult to handle. Also with the very large data sets. we start dealing with analytic and equipment issues where we need to be able to handle all of that data in a reasonable way. So, typically in a lab collection, we'd have 3 to 5 strides, maybe per treadmill, you get a few hundred over several minutes. But that's about it for the most part. But in real world collections, of course, we have the potential for thousands of steps over many days, depending on the equipment applications that we have. And of course, the compliance with participants using the devices. But the key is that measurement is happening in the setting that matters to them. It's where they move. And so if we're trying to, for example, modify movement, we're modifying and monitoring it in the environment that they're actually going to be using it day to day. As I mentioned, wearables is kind of the main piece of equipment to start doing this real world data collection, although some of the interesting markerless systems might be able to allow for several alternatives here. But it's important to consider the specs and the implementation that you have when you're trying to, or the implementation of these wearables when you're trying to do real world collections. And then, of course, validity and reliability is important with these tools as well. And from the review that Dylan and I and other colleagues from the lab, it's not being done very well right now. We definitely need better work examining the validity and reliability of wearables. So just as a kind of a quick plug for a study that we're doing right now, we're using a shoe embedded sensor, and participants are walking with that for 7 days. And it measures the foot progression angle, which most of you are probably familiar with. And what you can see here is a histogram over the steps that we've collected over the 7 days of one participant. And the histogram very quickly converges on the lab measured foot progression angle. And it's pretty interesting to see how robust the histogram becomes over time as we gather more and more data. This is just to show the power of some real world data collection. So just to kind of wrap it up for real world data and kind of moving beyond the lab, I think it's important that we consider the equipment that we're selecting, the specs of the equipment, how we're applying it, how feasible it is for people to use it. And of course, we need to have some equipment and procedures involved to deal with the massive amounts of data. In some cases, I've got 7-8 million data points that I'm trying to manage. Data classification becomes important, especially when people are wearing the sensors for all sorts of different activities throughout the day. And generally, I think we shy away from variability, but variability can be an outcome in and of itself. It's not necessarily a bad thing. So certainly consider it as an outcome. Lastly, because we're often using wearables in these settings, we often need some tech savvy participants, and that could be a good thing, but it can also be a limiter, as we know some older adults might struggle with navigating technology. And then lastly, wearables is really in this Wild West stage where almost anything goes. And so we really need to think hard about the methods that we're implementing and how reliable and robust they are. So finally, to finish up, I think Canada has a fantastic history in biomechanics, particularly in OA biomechanics. And through the CSB, through the MSK Rehab Network, we have the opportunity to really develop some interesting collaborations and combine data and get away from this traditional biomechanics framework. I truly think that the juice is definitely worth the squeeze.
Great, thanks very much, Jesse. I think in the interest of time, we won't take questions, but if you have any comments for Jesse, feel free to reach out to him directly, or we can hold it for the GateNet session, which will be coming up after the trainee talks. So moving on, our next, we've got a tag team from McMaster, Drs. Nick Bryson and Anthony Gaddy. They're going to be looking at machine learning and cartilage loss in knee OA. Dr. Nick Bryson completed his PhD with Dr. Monica Malley at McMaster. He's now a postdoc at the Julius Wolf Institute in Berlin for the past 3 years. His main interests are knee injury cohorts, dynamic MRI, and using that to characterize early onset OA. And Dr. Anthony Gaddy's research looks at statistical and machine learning methods, applying that to medical imaging and biomechanical data for the purpose of understanding knee health and disease. As mentioned, he did his PhD with Dr. Malley as well. And starting this fall, he'll be continuing this line of research at Stanford University. So I'll hand it over to you two.
Perfect, thank you. Hi, everyone. So today I'm actually very happy to present our work that we recently published in Arthritis and Rheumatology. And this work was made possible through international collaboration between researchers from the Julius Wolff Institute in Germany, from McMaster, and from the University of Waterloo in Canada. So just to provide some quick background, so we know that mechanical loading is implicated in the onset and the progression of OA. And more precisely, we think that it's higher compressive loading that leads to cartilage loss. So a main goal of the research community is to confirm whether these contact forces are in fact related to joint degeneration. And this is something that research has not yet explicitly shown. And this is due to the fact that either joint contact forces cannot be measured in people with native knees, or knees with instrumented implants are devoid of soft tissues. So it's kind of a double whammy. So what we do instead is we commonly use indirect methods to estimate knee loads, either with MSK modeling or surrogate measures of joint loading from inverse dynamics, such as the CAM or the KFM. And then the relationship between these estimated loads and cartilage degeneration can be examined. And this is what a lot of prior studies have done. But we wanted to improve upon this prior work by directly linking the contact forces and cartilage loss in OA. So the purpose of our study was to determine the relationship between the predicted medial contact force, or the MCF peak during walking, and changes in medial tibial cartilage volume over 2.5 years in people with knee OA. And to achieve this goal, we used 2 data sets. So the first data set was from 9 patients with instrumented tibial implants as a result of TKA, and these people were from the Julius Wolff Institute. And the second data set was from 47 older adults with clinical and radiographic knee OA from McMaster University. For the knee OA sample only, MRI scans were required at both baseline and about 2.5 years later. And over this time, the mean reduction in the medial tibial cartilage volume was 2.6% per year, or 6.8% over the duration of the study. And this exceeded measurement error of 3.6%. And then for both groups, we acquired gait data with a motion capture system and a force plate. And this is as participants performed barefoot walking. For the knee OA group, gait data were acquired only once at baseline. And for the implant group, data were collected on multiple occasions over 8 years post-TKA. We used inverse dynamics to compute the CAM, the KFM, and the vertical knee reaction force, or VKRF for short. And for the instrumented implant group, we also extracted the medial knee contact force, which was measured directly and synchronously from the knee implant during gait.
All right, so I'm going to take it over here from the analysis and results part. So in this study, we did 2 parts, as kind of Nick alluded to. So step 1 was developing this equation to predict the medial contact force, and this was done in instrumented patients. And so to do that, we used a machine learning method, lasso regression, or least absolute shrinkage and selection operator. And so I briefly want to talk about lasso. 2 points I want to touch on. Number 1 is many of you, or all of you, I'm sure, have used least squares regression in some way. So this is similar to that, except for we have a tunable parameter on the end of it. In this case, it's called lambda. And the way we can think about this is we change lambda to get the best model. And this is similar to how you may do a forward selection or backwards deletion or stepwise regression. The simplicity, though, is we just change this one number. The second point that is related is that this lambda, or optimal lambda, is identified on prediction error on unseen data. So the goal here is to be able to have the best equation that can predict the medial contact force in participants that weren't used to fit the model. So we want to generalize the equation. And so to do this, we had a number of predictors. These included the CAM peak, the CAM impulse, the KFM peak, the vertical knee reaction force peak, as well as gait speed, body mass, height, and BMI. So all these terms, squared versions of all these terms, and all possible two-way interactions. So we had a lot of potential predictors. So there's a potential that it could have gotten a bit complicated. However, it's really nice that the top left of the slide shows the identified predictors, which were gait speed, CAM peak, which was talked about lots today, and the vertical knee reaction force peak. And so I think that this is a relatively simple combination of predictors that make a lot of sense to us, and I hope to many of you as well. So on the right here, we're showing the actual relationship between the measured medial contact force peak on the x-axis and the predicted medial contact force peak on the y-axis. The orange line is showing a one-to-one relationship. So if we had a perfect prediction, all the points would be on that line. As you can see, they're not perfectly on the line, but we have a pretty good fit close to the line, and there's definitely a spread of the data. So as MCF goes up, we get an increase in our prediction that coincides with it reasonably. I will note, so as Nick said, we had 9 participants only, and we have more than 200 data points here. So this data is over multiple years. So there's multiple visits from each participant and multiple different gait speeds. And so the hope here is that having more data under a greater context, we can generalize the equation better. And I do think we achieved that, which will kind of hopefully be evident by some of what I talk about in a few moments. So step 2 is using this equation in the NEOA sample here in Canada. So to do that, we first use the equation to predict the medial contact force in the NEOA patients. Again, these are using those parameters, gait speed, vertical knee reaction force, and the CAM, and relatively easy to acquire in a gait lab. And the second was just fitting the relationship using simple linear regression between the predicted contact force and the cartilage change. And here is that relationship for you. So on the x-axis, we have the predicted contact force, and on the y-axis, we have the change in medial tibial cartilage volume. And so again, noting we have medial contact force and medial changes in cartilage. So this, we have apples to apples, and we have a good comparison here. And so as you all note, we see what we would expect to see, which is really nice that we kind of confirm this commonly held belief that the contact forces on the medial side of the joint do relate to cartilage change over time. I will note the R-squared is 0.35, which is, I think, is a reasonable value. It's not 0.99, and I don't think we expect it to be, as was kind of mentioned today in the study. There are many other factors relevant to OA, and mechanics is just one of them that explains a reasonable amount of variance, but not all of it. So there's a few points I want to just touch on about the study and some implications. So number one, it's very nice that we saw this expected relationship that we thought would happen. The second point is that we have these accurate predictions of medial contact force that can be modeled from external biomechanical variables. So, and they're relatively easy to use. So it's a simple linear equation using, again, 3 easy parameters that we get in our labs: gait speed, CAM, and the vertical knee reaction force. And then the second one is that the errors are comparable or actually smaller than the best statistical models that have been proposed before, or the most complex MSK models. And those are ones using medical imaging, EMG, EMG-informed muscle contractions, etc. And so I think this is promising, particularly in light of things like THEA, markerless mocap, that we can more easily get these parameters, or things like video data that may be able to estimate some of the parameters like the CAM. And the last point is that we think that we have a real, just to confirm that we have a real construct being measured here. So in the secondary analysis that I haven't talked about here today, not only did we relate the predicted MCF and cartilage change, but we also looked at finding the best possible model we could create to predict cartilage change using the same constituent predictors of the MCF equation. So using CAM, VKRF, and gait speed. And so what we found was that our model that was fit on people in Germany that were mostly men with instrumented knees wasn't any different than the best possible combination of those predictors at predicting in the NEOA sample at predicting cartilage loss. And so the thought or rationale, or what I want to promote here, is that this equation in that sample in Germany generalized to a NEOA sample in Canada that was mostly women that don't have replacements, and was still meaningfully related to cartilage loss, meaning that we have something we think that is useful in predicting a real metric of medial loading. And so the conclusion here is, again, we have this easy equation. We hope that others can use it, and we hope that they build upon it. This is step 1, we think. And that it gives us meaningful predictors that we all talk about, like CAM and VKRF, that can be used to modify joint loading and at least the mechanical component of cartilage generation. So in summary, I just want to thank all the supporters of the funders of this work, both in Canada as well as Germany, and our co-authors in both countries. This wouldn't be possible without both groups.
Great, thanks very much, Nick and Anthony. I think the thing I like the best is when you talked about easy to use and easy to implement. I mean, that's kind of what we want. Any quick one-off questions from the group? Okay, again, we will, oh, go ahead, Dylan.
There we go. There we go. Great talk. Yeah, I loved the way you were able to kind of bring that together. I also love seeing your hair down, Anthony. I don't think I've ever seen your hair down, so that's great to see. I guess just a quick question on, I think you said you had 9 people in the prediction there. So are you predicting with the held out people, like those people are totally out, or is it across, like what's that training look like?
Exactly. So it was so to find the predictors, it was a leave one out cross validation, but our leave one wasn't 1 point, it was 1 person. So if one person had 10 data points, all of the data points were held out when we were trying to find the optimal combination of predictors.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And so obviously that's tough data to get, right? But do you have any plans to get it, like some more of that stuff, or what's your sort of next step with it, right? To extend it, as you said.
I think Nick is best to comment here, but I think they have more on hip, if I'm not mistaken. You're muted.
Yeah, we have access to a knee cohort and a hip cohort as well. So this is actually very unique data that we're happy to have. These patients now have 10-year follow-ups. So we actually used all the data that we had for the knee implant patients in this particular analysis. We used the individual trials. But yeah, moving forward, it would be great to also use these parameters to fine-tune MSK models, for example, and improve those aspects.
Awesome, thanks.
Sounds good. Derek, I see you've got your hand up, but we are a bit behind. So either you can reach out to Anthony or Nick, or we can hold it for the GateNet session if that's okay. Perfect, thanks. So our final speaker is Holly Philpott. She's a PhD candidate at Western in the Wobble Lab, working with Dr. Trevor Birmingham and Dr. Tom Appleton. She's investigating the link between biomechanics and knee joint physiology. So we are kind of finishing off here. We talked a lot about biomechanics and imaging, and now we're going to talk a little bit more about the biological side as well. So Holly, over to you.
Thank you. Sorry, my screen just jumped around to me a little bit. Just 1 second. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that and hear me. So our group is particularly interested in synovium. So I'm just gonna jump right in and give a brief background on the importance of synovium, both in OA knees as well as healthy knees. So in healthy knees, it's responsible for maintaining joint homeostasis and joint health. In OA knees, synovitis or inflammation of the synovium has been shown to contribute to the pathogenesis of knee OA and has also been shown to be associated with worse outcomes. We do know that there is significant crosstalk between the synovium and the cartilage, meaning we need to better understand the biology of synovium so we can understand all the impacts that it may have on the cartilage, whether those are good or bad. And we have seen signs in our patient synovium that it does experience physiologic stress. So what I'm showing here is a histological sample of one of our patients where you can see these white halos around the blood vessels in the synovium, and this is known as perivascular edema. And this occurs in tissues under stressful physiologic states and has been identified in other disease contexts. In knee OA, we know that the joint is subjected to multiple forms of stress, including mechanical stress and mechanical loading. However, the mechanisms underlying this phenomenon of perivascular edema in OA have not been investigated, and it's often a part of the histopathology system that's overlooked. So our overall goal for our project broadly is to understand the role of synovium in OA and its influence on patient outcomes, and then more specifically to investigate the relationship of synovial physiology to biomechanics. And our specific question for the study I'm going to show today was, is synovial perivascular edema associated with measures of joint loading? So I'll briefly describe our study design. We are running a prospective cohort that's currently ongoing. So we use the baseline data for our cross-sectional analyses. Patients were recruited from 2 clinics, all undergoing surgical management for knee OA, either total knee arthroplasty or high tibial osteotomy. And their preoperative assessments were completed at the Wolf Orthopedic Biomechanics Lab, or WOBBLE. Our final sample for the study included 92 patients with neutral or varus alignment and medial joint space narrowing greater than lateral joint space narrowing. For gait analysis, we used a movement analysis system. The first 5 clean foot strikes were used for data processing. Inverse dynamics were used to calculate frontal, sagittal, and transverse knee moments over 100% of stance, both in Newton meters and represented as percent body weight times height. Our synovial tissue biopsies were acquired at the time of surgery from the lateral suprapatellar recess and underwent routine hematoxylin and eosin histopathology staining. Perivascular edema was graded, and then the cohort was separated into the absence or presence of perivascular edema. And again, I'm just showing some representative histological sections here where we see these white halos around the vessels in this patient's synovium, but we don't see them over here on the right panel. So for our statistical analyses, we used a methodology known as polynomial mixed effects regression. And this allows us to fit our models over 100% of stance using polynomial or nonlinear functions. So stance in this case is treated similar to a time variable. Our outcomes were knee moments in either the frontal, sagittal, or transverse planes. And our predictor of interest was perivascular edema. Our models were adjusted for important covariates, and then the random intercepts were specified by patient ID to account for variance between patients. We were also able to do pairwise comparisons between the groups over 100% of stance. So here I'm just showing the baseline demographics and clinical characteristics for the whole cohort, as well as separated by the presence and absence of edema. And just highlighting that the clinical characteristics are evenly distributed between the edema and no edema groups. And here are the unadjusted ensemble averages for the groups. Edema is shown in red and no edema is shown in blue. The y-axis here is represented the moments as percent body weight times height, and the bars represent standard deviation at the peaks. And we can see that there are differences between the groups here, but I'll get more in depth when I discuss our polynomial regression results. So starting with the frontal plane, we were able, looking at the graph on the left-hand side here, able to model the frontal plane moments over 100% of stance while adjusting for age, sex, BMI, and gait speed. The y-axis represents the moments in Newton meters, and then the group means are shown there in red or blue with 95% confidence intervals at each point in stance. When we look at the pairwise comparisons or the mean difference, which is the graph on the right, we can see that the frontal plane moment was higher between the groups between 16 and 74% of stance, where those 95 confidence intervals do not include 0. And the edema group looks like the largest differences between the groups were between 20 and 40% of stance here. And I just want to mention that this approach can be useful for assessing the different phases of stance, so early, mid stance, and late stance, and specific portions of the curve where you might expect to see greater loading or unloading. So moving on to the sagittal plane, we saw that the groups differed across the majority of stance, so between 15 and 92%, with the largest differences seeming to be between 40 and 75% of stance here. And finally, the transverse plane moment, we saw small differences between 64 and 68% of stance, where the 95% confidence interval is just shy of including 0. So those differences are quite small. So just to summarize our findings, we found that the presence of perivascular edema was associated with altered knee moments during walking. And it seems to be important for the frontal and sagittal plane moments, where we saw the largest differences there in early stance. But we do note that there was statistically significant differences in all 3 planes in late stance. And this taken together provides a link between biomechanics and synovial biology, which is pretty exciting for our group and shows integration of different types of data with gait data. I also just want to highlight our methodology again of polynomial mixed effects regression. And this provides information on the relationship at different phases of stance while being able to statistically adjust for important covariates. And then just highlighting some limitations, our results can only be interpreted in the context of those with late stage knee OA and predominantly medial compartment knee OA. Due to the cross-sectional nature of our analysis, the longitudinal relationship between loading and edema, as well as the causality and directionality of the relationship currently remain unclear. And then the biopsy location can vary from other synovial locations in the joint, but we tried to mitigate this by acquiring the biopsies from the same location in each patient. And then just to finish off with some clinical relevance of our findings. So in other disease contexts, we know that perivascular edema is associated with pathogenesis and progression of disease. And showing here an association between joint loading and edema supports the phenomenon of mechanoinflammation in OA, but also the biomechanical profiles we've identified in our edema patients have been shown previously to be associated with knee-OA severity and progression. So there's been a lot of emphasis on how aberrant loading is associated with articular cartilage breakdown. However, our data would suggest that it's not just cartilage wear and tear that's a result of altered or aberrant loading, but also mechanical stress on the joint can lead to differences in synovial physiology. So our future work for the group is to investigate the mechanisms of edema and how it would impact OA pathogenesis and outcomes. And this furthers our understanding of the biological connection between joint loading and outcomes in knee OA. And I just want to say thanks to all the collaborators on this project, all my lab mates and our funding sources.
Great, thanks very much, Holly. And that, I mean, I get a really nice finale to the set of talks. Again, talking about let's try to get away from just looking at one thing and trying to bring in some of the more complexities of the disease and the illness. So that was great. We'll have time for one very quick question, because I do know that we need to get moving on to the final part. So Dan Ramsey, I see you've got your hand up. So if you got a quick question, that's great.
Holly, that was an outstanding presentation, and I really need to congratulate you on an outstanding research endeavor. My question to you is that one of the things you didn't address in your cohort, so you controlled for age, you controlled for BMI, and you controlled for a couple of other variables that I can't recall right now. But you know, a previous history of knee injury, particularly ACL tear, has a great impact on the mechanisms that exacerbate OA. And I was wondering why that was not considered in your cohort.
Thanks for that question. That's a really great point. We do collect data on previous knee injury as well as previous surgeries in these patients. So I agree with you. Perhaps doing a sensitivity analysis where we include that covariate would be a good idea for this particular analysis.
Okay, and one other question I have for you is, in one of your slides, you're identifying some particular events, and they had a very large degree of variability. So were the differences at those particular events, were they statistically significant, or did the data get washed out as a result of the variability?
Yeah, so in the ensemble averages, where we're only representing those moments in percent body weight times height, the variability will be a little bit higher there. And then in our polynomial regression, we're able to control for other confounders. It does tighten that variability a little bit. And so using that mean difference, pairwise comparison across stance, and just looking at the regions where the 95% confidence intervals don't include 0 is how we interpret that.
Okay. That's something I need to investigate a little bit more in detail, because that's a very interesting statistical technique. So again, thank you very much for an outstanding presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much for the question, Dan. So we'll close this part of the symposium. And again, thanks very much to the 6 speakers. Really great overview of how we can do more and how we can do better, which I think is a nice lead into the final part for the next 15-20 minutes or so. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Cozy